So now we've gone over that series of things that the elite people in the cabal that are the private investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman and clients for the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. Here, I'll move this over here a little bit more. I'm a little off center with everybody. Okay, and what the steps are that they took at the end of the Cold War to begin setting up different institutions that they could, from which they could function and carry out their same agenda of basically promoting and fostering a fascist ideology in the world. A major one of which is the major base they established in South America, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Peru, and Chile, and Uruguay, and Paraguay, etc., and shipping in hundreds and hundreds of high-level Nazi officials and SS officers, etc., and they were functioning from there and had the base set up inside the security department of Pemex, the Mexican National Oil Company, and of course then creating the Central Intelligence Agency and having a whole covert operations directorate inside the CIA, out of which they were engaged in promoting fascist ideology around the world, using funds in part that they had gotten from the Anderson Trust. This trust, the secret trust that had been set up with a $1.2 trillion of gold and platinum and silver and jewels that had been uncovered in the Philippines by Edward Lansdale in conjunction with General MacArthur and his chief of intelligence, Charles Willoughby, that came and told Truman about the existence of that, and Truman ended up setting up the secret trust, the Anderson Trust, and placing two of the senior partners of Brown Brothers Harriman being in charge of utilizing these $1.2 trillion in gold certificates that were issued. We covered all of the setting up of that type of a structure, and what I'm going to do next week, or excuse me, on Thursday, on Thursday, I'm going to print out for you and have a big visual chart of the structure of all of these different organizations that they had set up. The World Commerce Corporation and the International Commerce Corporation and the Field Intelligence, Field Operations Intelligence, and the other things that I've been talking to you about. But it's hard to really get a sense of how kind of all-encompassing these types of institutions were unless you get a look at them in the structure that they set up. And then I went through the whole process leading up to the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then the events that started taking place after the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis that basically started causing the one group after another to develop such an intense hostility to Kennedy that they were actually starting to contemplate killing him in order to stop him from doing the kind of things he was doing. That we know that after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy stated that he was going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds because of their not only deceiving him about the Bay of Pigs prospects, but explicitly trying to trap him into having to go ahead and commit U.S. Marine Corps troops into invading Cuba rather than losing. And he was really angry at them for that. And then they came to him later in March of 1962 proposing Operation Northwoods to him to dress up the Cuban refugees, the exiles in Cuban military uniforms, and have them attack Guantanamo naval base and kill American sailors and sink American ships and blow up shopping malls in Miami and in Washington, D.C. And we started seeing what it is that Kennedy started to do. When he was confronted on that night of October 27th and 28th of 1962 with the full decision on the part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a unanimous decision to attack the island of Cuba, with full realization that this would result in a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, because this had followed their effort back in earlier in 1963, in July of 1963, where they tried to get Kennedy to agree to a first strike nuclear sneak attack against the Soviet Union, that they had become convinced that we had such a dominant lead in the nuclear missiles that we could flatten the Soviet Union and kill virtually all of their population in a sneak attack before they could effectively retaliate against us. And Kennedy had been grossly offended at what it is that they were recommending. And so that there was this growing division between not Kennedy and not only his Central Intelligence Agency, but his Joint Chiefs of Staff and others, because Kennedy had clearly, as I discussed with you, had this kind of metanoia experience on that night of October 27th to 28th, when he was confronted with the insistence on the part of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff that they be allowed to attack Cuba and trigger a nuclear exchange. And ever since that type of experience, we remember that when we reviewed the steps that Kennedy started taking to order the stand down from DEFCON 2 that Curtis LeMay had ordered everybody to go to without the president's consent, the order from Kennedy to withdraw the Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for Khrushchev agreeing to withdraw the missiles from Cuba, his reaching out to open up a back channel of communications to Fidel Castro to normalize relations with Cuba, and then engaging in this exchange of these 18 super secret letters using Norman Cousins, the journalist that ran the Post, to communicate these letters back and forth, pursuant to which Kennedy was planning to try to disassemble the nuclear warheads of the Soviet Union and the United States. We went through these series of activities that were going on from that night of October 27, 28 of 1962, all the way during the year of 1963, when Kennedy, step by step, was taking these steps to do these various things. And I want to pick it up here at this point to really start to give you a clear understanding of the kind of drumbeat that was going on with Kennedy planning to do these things for, as we knew, that one of the main things that triggered these resentments was that after the resolution of the Bay of Pigs, I told you that Frank Sturgis, who was in charge of the exile paramilitary camp on No Name Key, on December 3rd of 1962, launched a military attack against the Russian ship in the harbor, in Havana Harbor, and sank it. And Kennedy, Bobby, and John sent in the helicopter gunships and burnt out that base, and then did the same thing with regard to the base in the Everglades that was under the coordination of E. Howard Hunt. And this caused the people that were directly involved, these extreme right-wing Cuban anti-communist paramilitary groups, to want to kill Kennedy. They were so furious with him for betraying them, and that Kennedy had also begun this process that he was going through. Actually led him to issue a secret national security action memorandum. He issued this is National Security Action Memorandum 239 that he issued to the State Department ordering the ambassador to Russia, who was Averill Harriman, who is the son of E.H. Harriman, of Brown Brothers Harriman. He ordered Averill Harriman to go to Russia and to propose to the Soviets a nuclear test ban treaty. And Averill Harriman refused to do it. He went there, but he never made the proposal to them. But the fact is that Kennedy then, through his private correspondence with Khrushchev in these 18 letters, on August 5th of 1963, he entered into an agreement with Khrushchev that they were going to take steps to disassemble the nuclear warheads. And Kennedy got the United States Senate to ratify a partial test ban treaty on September 24th of 1963. He actually got them to agree to ban all nuclear testing in the atmosphere, all nuclear testing under the oceans, and all nuclear testing in outer space. So that he and Khrushchev were able to get that part actually agreed to by the United States Senate. But he had given this secret order to Averill Harriman to actually get an agreement as part of the treaty to disassemble all of the nuclear weapons of both the Soviet Union and the United States. And obviously Averill Harriman told others in the elite community. As you know, that Harriman of Brown Brothers Harriman, they would share with the other private investors in Brown Brothers Harriman these types of strategic decisions that were being made by Kennedy. And so that we know that by September of 1963, Averill Harriman had refused to submit that request to the Soviet Union, but Kennedy had succeeded through his private correspondence with Khrushchev to secure this agreement to disassemble the nuclear warheads. Then later in June, on June 5th, actually a little bit earlier, this extraordinarily interesting and important event took place. Walter Sheridan, who was a very important close confidant of Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General under John Kennedy, Walter Sullivan comes to Bobby Kennedy and informs Bobby Kennedy about the existence of the S-Force, that this private assassination team that had been assembled by Santos Trafficante to assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the others, that Bobby was informed about this on June 5th, and he issued an order to order that operation to stand down. And what happened, extraordinarily interestingly, is that on June 10th, President Kennedy makes this public speech at American University in their commencement, in which he basically tells the world that we have to disassemble nuclear weapons, we've got to get rid of these weapons, we've got to have peace with the Soviet Union. It's the very famous speech that he undertook, and it was a public coming out, as it were, of Kennedy, basically throwing down on the national security state bureaucracy by going directly to the people and using the bully pulpit of the presidency to reach out to the people to get them to come on board supporting what it was that he was attempting to do. And this was supported by the issuance by Pope John XXIII of a major encyclical letter called Pacem in Terris, in which John XXIII himself reiterated basically the same principles that Kennedy was just soon later to announce in his June 10th speech. And all of this was going on in April, May, and June of 1963, right in the face of the national security state bureaucracy that had less than a year earlier wanted to initiate a thermonuclear war with Russia. And so Immediately following his June 10th speech at American University, Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy issued these orders prohibiting any further activities on the part of the S-Force. And what happened is on June 18th of 1963, after having received the order that they were to stand down on any further efforts on the part of the S-Force to assassinate Castro or any of the others, there was a group that assembled in Florida under the direction of William D. Pauley. Now you remember that William D. Pauley is the guy who actually authored the Doolittle Commission report back in 1954, in which he said that we had to develop a unit inside the Central Intelligence Agency that was more ruthless and effective in destroying our enemies than any activities that were undertaken by our enemies. And this is William D. Pauley. And William D. Pauley, after the order was issued to stand down the S-Force and to stop any attempt to assassinate Castro, he organized a group of some 10 people, several of whom were members of the S-Force, and he, under the ruse, this is very important for you, if you ever hear about this in the news, under the ruse of trying to assemble a group of people to go into Cuba and bring out 2 high-level Russian military officers who would be able to tell the world that Khrushchev had lied and he was not, in fact, disassembling the nuclear weapons, and that they were still going forward and assembling the nuclear weapons. And William D. Pauley made up this entire fiction of what it is they were doing, and under the cover of the fiction of going in and bringing a unit of people into Cuba to help bring out these 2 Russian officers, they were going in to assassinate Castro. This operation, they codenamed Operation Tilt. And on June 18th, there were a series of meetings on the 15th and 16th of June. Now, I happen to know about these because one of my investigators during the Iran-Contra case, Richard Billings, was at the time the Miami bureau chief for Life magazine. And because Henry Luce, who was the editor or the owner of Life magazine, because he was so entangled in the efforts to overthrow Castro, and as you remember, I told you, he, on the front page of 8 of his different issues of Time magazine, Life magazine, and Fortune magazine, he had on 8 different occasions put on the front covers of those magazines Hitler or Franco or Mussolini praising fascism in Europe. And that he's the guy that in 1941, early 41, he had issued the editorial in Time magazine called the American Century, in which he had explicitly called upon the American people to support him in opposing the United States going to war against Germany in Europe, and to allow Hitler to take control of all of Europe to be able to establish a bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. In Henry Luce, as the editor and owner of Life magazine, Life magazine had sent a representative, their Miami bureau chief, to go with this group of people, with William D. Pauley and the others that were going to be going in on his yacht called the Flying Tiger, because he, in fact, had financed, and I'll go into some more details later, he was a guy financing a thing called the Flying Tigers, in which he and Henry Luce's wife, Claire Booth Luce, were actually financing the flying of weapons over to the Kuomintang in China. That was all being paid for by the income from the heroin trafficking that was being brought out of the Southeast Asian Golden Triangle through the Corsican Mafia and into Havana under Batista that I told you about. Now, I'm just going back through a few of these things to kind of reorient you to what it is that you're seeing happening here. In the summer, the spring and summer of 1963, following the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, with Kennedy having made this turn after that night of the metanoia experience that he had, he was undertaking this series of ascending steps to disassemble the nuclear weapons, to bring about détente with the Soviet Union, to basically undo everything that had taken basically 100 years for these robber barons to move into place, of bringing the United States into a position of being a hegemonic force in the world, developing a military that was superior to everyone else in the world, to be able to project U.S. military power into the world and all of these major naval bases and military bases, to basically be able to secure privileged access to the strategic raw materials that the major corporate owners wanted to have access to. They referred to it as markets. They wanted to have access to these markets. And they wanted to be assured that there was a capitalist economic system maintained in each of those countries. And they were doing this under the rubric of anti-communism. And so that you see these steps being taken by Kennedy throughout the period of 1963, following the October 28th successful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He continues to undertake these actions, and he had issued this order to stand down the S-Force once Bobby had been told about it on June 5th by Walter Sheridan. And so what happens is this group under William Pauley assembles this group of 10 anti-Castro Cubans, and they undertake this secret operation called Operation Tilt. And Dick Billings had actually gone to two of the planning meetings for this operation, along with a guy by the name of John Martino. John Martino was a Mafia lieutenant under Santos Trafficante. And he was involved in this operation. Dick Billings tells the story where he was in these two meetings where they were planning these things, and then on the night of June 18th, he ends up being called by John Martino, and it's time to go. They're ready to do this thing. So they go to William Pauley's house that was in Miami, Florida. And they go to his house, and they get on this little bus, and the bus drives them to the Miami National Airport. They have this area of the Miami National Airport in the northeastern corner that's nicknamed by all the snake eaters, as they refer to themselves, that this was called Corrosion Corner. And this is where Southern Air Transport flew out of. That was, in fact, an aircraft company that was started by William Pauley. And it became Southern Air Transport. And just like the other one, it had become Air America that was flying over in Southeast Asia. These were all operations that were begun by William Pauley, who, as I said, I'll give you more details about this guy, because you're going to find out why it is that it's so important that you know about Pauley. Because during the course of this mission, what they did is they all got on a PBY there at Corrosion Corner, which is one of these great big airborne boats, like these flying boats, like, you know, that Harrison Ford gets on all the time in the 1930s when he's, what's his name? Indiana Jones. Remember, they have the Indiana Jones thing where they show him going across the world in these little maps and landing in the, well, that's effectively a PBY. And so there's a PBY airborne boat waiting for them there at Corrosion Corner on the night of June 18th. They go and they get on the plane. And as they're getting on the plane, there's a guy there by the name of Rip Robertson. And William Rip Robertson turns out to be the field commander for the S-Force. And he's there in charge of the operation of everybody loading onto the PBY. There's a pilot by the name of Tosh Plumley who has also confirmed these activities, in addition to Dick Billings, to me, because I've talked with him directly about it. And they load the people up, and Dick Billings is there from Life magazine with his photographer to actually be there to record the event of these people going in and killing Castro and coming back out onto the Flying Tiger, and him being there to memorialize this historic event. And so that he's there with them, and they fly in the PBY, they fly down in the Caribbean, down off shore of Cuba. They land on the ocean at night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, and the Flying Tiger comes sailing up to them. So the Flying Tiger, the yacht that belonged to William D. Pauley, was the ship that they were actually going to be functioning from. And so they get out of the PBY and they inflate these rubber rafts, and they go out on the rubber rafts and they go over to the Flying Tiger and they board the Flying Tiger. And the Flying Tiger then takes them to a thing called Hognose Key, a little kind of atoll that is in the Caribbean off the shore of Cuba. And so they anchor there and they spend the night there. And they get up in the morning and they load up the boats, and they go offshore again, and they put the Cuban guys into this great big boat. It was about 22-foot long boat, he said, with these 2 outboard motors on it, and they were all loaded with long distance high powered rifles and equipment. And they set not sail, but they set out to go into the island of Cuba. And then they're all on the ship still, and they go back in the Flying Tiger, and they re-anchor at Hognose Reef, waiting for these guys to come back. And they're there that night. This is the night of the 19th now of June of 1963. And they're all on this yacht. And this yacht is mounted with a .50 caliber machine gun on the front prow of this boat. And in what William Pauley and John Martino and Rip Robertson and Dick Billings and Rudy Enders and a number of these other folks start getting drunk. And John Martino and they start throwing. They're fishing off the side of the boat, and they catch a fish, and they start reeling in one of the fish, and a shark attacks it. And so William Pauley gets up on the .50 caliber machine gun and slaughters the shark. And other sharks start to come because of all the blood. And then he starts killing all these sharks with his .50 caliber machine gun, and killing a dozen sharks and blood flying and everywhere. Then he takes out his .45 and starts killing them with like this. The fucking guy's a maniac. You got to understand what we're talking about here. I mean, this is William D. Pauley, the guy that wrote the Doolittle report about how we had to develop a capacity to be more ruthless than our enemies. And this guy's out of his mind, basically. And he's doing this crazy stuff, and they get that thing all ends up calming down, and they're on board drinking still, Jack Daniels, and getting utterly shit-faced and talking to each other. And John Martino starts becoming livid about Kennedy. And what a dirty bastard he is, and how he's betrayed us, and he's jumping up and down about this. And here's Dick Billings standing there with Rip Robertson and John Martino, with Martino jumping up and down, and William D. Pauley standing there. And Martino is calling Kennedy no good traitor, son of a bitch, and he's jumping up and down. And William Pauley turns to him and says, "Don't worry, John, we're going to kill that motherfucker." Okay. Now, so you say to yourself 2 things. What is the capacity of a guy like William D. Pauley to actually carry out such a thing? Who is sitting there basically helping to run the operation of these 10 Miami Cubans who've gone ashore to assassinate Castro, And he's sitting there kind of on top of that whole operation. And the second question you ask is, who is we? When he says, we're going to kill that motherfucker. Who is he talking about when he says something like that? It turns out these guys never came back. That nobody knows what happened to them, but they never did come back. And so Kennedy continues to go forward, not even knowing about that particular event. And he goes forward and actually issues a three-part order to the State Department. And this is called State Department Publication 7277. And this is a direct order to the State Department to undertake a three-stage step program toward disassembling the nuclear missiles of the United States. And the first step is to have this underwater, in outer space, in atmospheric ban on nuclear testing. And then they move to a general agreement to stand down and no longer use nuclear weapons. And the third step is the active disassembling of these. So he issues that, and it is talked about by McNamara, actually, on November 19th, talking about this memorandum that he had seen. And Kennedy, then earlier on October 11th, had issued this other National Security Action Memorandum that I told you about, number 263, in which he ordered the removal of 1,000 troops of the 16,000 troops that we had in Vietnam. He orders the removal of 1,000 of the troops, saying that this is just the first group to be removed, looking toward the removal of all 16,000 American troops from Vietnam by the end of 1965. Now, this is issued on October 11th of 1963. So he's basically talking about a 2-year period, assuming his reelection in November of 1964, where he's going to be removing all the troops from Vietnam. Now, this, as you might guess, this is a series of steps that are being taken by John Kennedy in response to the events of that night of October 26th and 27th, around the Cuban Missile Crisis. That he's become absolutely convinced that these people are basically nuts. That the process of the Cold War and the rabid anti-communism and the military buildup, the building up of more and more nuclear missiles, that they've actually become trapped in their own separate world, these CIA people and the military people, in that they're engaged in a plan to try to instigate a thermonuclear war with Russia. And he has decided that he has to exert his executive prerogatives to take steps to disassemble the missiles, to stop them from having access to this kind of power to destroy the world. So these steps are being taken. Then, in the first week of October, it turns out the Rex, which is a CIA warship, is engaged in an attempt to land Cuban paramilitary exiles on the island of Cuba in the first week of October. Now, the reason that this is so important is because it turns out that during Operation Tilt, the night after they'd had this drunken slaughter of the sharks and all of that, Dick Billings gets up the next morning and comes from below decks up on deck, and he sees the USS Rex sitting right off the yacht, refueling the yacht. Okay, and Paulie gets really upset because he didn't want anybody to see that. Because what that is it's a CIA ship that is based in Guantanamo. And that means that the Guantanamo naval base in the Department of Navy is in on this operation. And the CIA is in on this operation under the guidance of William Pauley and Rip Robertson. And that means that they're all acting in defiance of the president, and his attorney general, who have ordered all of them to stand down from these types of operations. And just 6 months later, 5 months later, in October, the first week of October, actually, the Rex is actually now engaged in trying to land Cuban exiles on the island of Cuba. And they're intercepted by the Cubans, and the Rex is seized by Cuba and taken into custody. And so that then Kennedy was planning to fly to Miami, because now you're coming into October in early November of 1963. This is only 1 year away from the 1964 presidential election. This is the election in which John Kennedy is going to be seeking re-election to his second term after having defeated Richard Nixon back in the 1960 election, much to the surprise of everybody from Howard Hughes to his lawyer Bob Mayhew in Trafficante and all the rest of the guys that were all involved in smuggling the heroin through Havana to help fund the operations going to this International Commerce Corporation under the ownership of William Pauley, who owned and ran this International Commerce Corporation, which is the group that took the money from the heroin sales and purchased the weapons and equipment and explosives to have the Flying Tigers, run by William Pauley, to fly the weapons and stuff into China, to the Kuomintang, to have them try to now oppose Mao. Okay? So that you can see that William Pauley keeps showing up over and over in these operations. And Kennedy now, 1 year before the election coming up, decides that he's going to have to go down and start securing the Democratic votes for him to remain in the presidency. And so he plans a trip in the early fall to fly to Miami. And before he leaves from Andrews Air Force Base, they receive emergency messages that he can't come to Miami because he's going to be assassinated if he goes to Miami. That there's a plot afoot to assassinate him with a triangular crossfire of high-powered rifles from office buildings during his caravan into Miami. And so they cancel that trip. And 2 weeks later, they substitute for it a planned trip to Chicago to secure the endorsement of Boss, what's his name in Chicago? Daley, Boss Daley. He's going out there to get to see him, and he's notified at the last minute that he can't go to Chicago because there's a plan in Chicago to assassinate him if he arrives there. And so he cancels that trip. And then he decides that he's going to go to Dallas. And he's planning that trip to leave on November 20th to go down to Dallas to cement his relations with John Connally and others there. So we've come through this entire process at the end of the Cold War of these people who had originally funded the rise of the Third Reich in Germany as the bulwark against Bolshevism. Now, having come into the war, once Roosevelt had figured out how to get the United States into the war by coaxing Japan into attacking our ships at Pearl Harbor, and now we're at war in Germany, and these members of this rich elite crowd, the ultra-rich elite, they had gone into the State Department and OSS, in the Defense Department, and gotten into these high-level positions of being in a position to, at the end of the Cold War, as I told you, basically let all of the Nazis go. To not, in fact, prosecute them really much at Nuremberg, and to actually let them out, even the ones that got convicted. The ones that were given life sentences are released after 2 or 3 years. And hundreds of others of the high command of the Nazi political party and the SS are basically taken out of Europe through the Odessa, through the rat line, with the cooperation of the Vatican and Pope Pius XII, and brought down into Argentina, in Uruguay and Paraguay and Peru, and right at the end of the war, William Pauli is made the ambassador to Peru, where these Nazis are all infesting this place down there. And he becomes the American ambassador, and he starts writing letters to get rid of everybody in the U.S. Embassy in Peru who are trying to warn Truman that there are Nazis everywhere down here. That they're being advisors to the government, they're in the military, and that they've got to do something. And Pauli takes steps to get them all fired, saying that they're communists. And then he gets transferred to be the ambassador to Brazil, where other ones are there. And he then undertakes the process of getting to fire all of these other guys who are trying to tell Truman that there's Nazis everywhere here in Brazil. And so there's Pauli again. And so we get to this place here where after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy is taking all of these steps, basically a dozen different specific actions that he's engaged in, which are clearly attempting to disassemble the tools and the equipment of the national security state here in the United States to try to pull the United States back from this campaign of imperialism and hegemony that they're engaged in around the world. And so the question that arises now is, by November of 1963, who is it that wants to kill him? When you hear William D. Pauli, on the night of June 19th of 1963, saying that we are going to kill him, who is he talking about? Is he talking about just the S-Force, some members of which had been there on the yacht and were presently at that time ashore trying to assassinate Castro in complete defiance of the direct orders of the president? Was he talking about more than that? Because you also had Allen Dulles had been fired. That John Kennedy fired Allen Dulles at the end of 1962. Actually the end of 1963, in 1961, that the April Bay of Pigs operation had come down, and Kennedy allowed a certain period of grace after that had happened, and then forced into retirement Allen Dulles in July of 1961. So Dulles was really upset about that, and he also fired Charles Cabell, who was the deputy to Allen Dulles. He also fired Richard Bissell, who was there in the Miami station. He fired a handful of these people, so they were angry at him. And remember, he had said he was going to splinter the Central Intelligence Agency into 1,000 pieces and spread them to the winds. And so that the lifers in the CIA, in the hierarchy of the CIA, who had been in fact engaged since its inception in major political assassinations, in overthrows of democratically elected governments, also were in a position to want to get rid of Kennedy. And remember that even though Allen Dulles had been terminated as being the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, as first civilian director, he still had all of the same juice, all the same power that actually had gotten him appointed to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was still chief counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman. He was still the senior partner at Sullivan and Cromwell. He still had all of the connections that he had to all of the fascists in Germany that were left in positions of power, who had ascended from positions of power where they were hidden out at the end of World War II in 1945 and 46, but had been given new names and had been elevated into positions of power using the secret funds of the Anderson Trust to putting them into positions, high-level positions inside the major corporations in Germany. And Dulles still had his favorable connections and relations with all of those people. So Dulles was still a man of great power, despite the fact that he had been stood down as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And so that so we come to this question of who is it that William Pauley is talking about on the night of June 19th of 1963 when he says that we're going to kill President Kennedy. And so what I want to do is I want to give you just a little sense here more because it turns out that he is an extraordinarily important and central person in what you're going to be finding out about in the next several lectures as we begin to talk about the actual assassination of the president and what effect it had and who was involved in this. And I've had Noah forward to you today on the emails. It's a little late, you probably didn't get to see them today. But there's an internet synopsis of a book that's been published now about William D. Pauley. We've ordered the book, and we should get 2 of them probably. We'll put one on reserve for you because it's really important for you to understand the details of this guy. Because William D. Pauley he had extraordinary power inside the administration. That he had in fact not only been the ambassador to Peru and later to Brazil. He was trying to develop in Brazil the oil reserves in Brazil for Standard Oil, which of course is Rockefeller, who are private investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman. And he had become close friends with J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI, trying to get Hoover to support his protection of the fascists down in Latin America and to initiate investigations of the people in those embassies who he wanted to get rid of, who were constantly trying to warn Truman about the existence of all of these Nazis and fascists down there. And so he had become close friends with J. Edgar Hoover. Then Pauley organized a conference in Rio de Janeiro in Argentina of all the leaders of the South American nations who were the basic fascist dictators who were down there. He brings them all together and tries to get General Marshall, George Marshall, who was the author and instigator of the Marshall Plan in Europe, trying to get Marshall to generate an equal type of operation in Latin America that was going to sustain the major capitalist business corporations in Latin America against the kind of potential onslaught of these socialists and communists. And then he begins, Pauley actually begins to work directly to establish U.S. air bases in Europe in all of the fascist countries, starting in Spain with Franco, who was still in power at the end of the war, and then he sets up this world, the Commerce International, this group that I told you that was receiving the portion of the profits from the heroin sales from the Sea Supply Corporation with Paul Helliwell of the CIA. He sets up this corporation which is facilitating the flow of the funds and military equipment into the Kuomintang in China. And so he becomes a major power. In fact, he is made, catch this, he is made a special assistant to the Secretary of State on anti-communist affairs. And he is made also a special assistant to Secretary of Defense Robert Lovett. Robert Lovett being one of the trustees of the Anderson Trust and a senior partner in Brown Brothers Harriman. And Pauly sets up this civil air transport, which becomes Air America in Southeast Asia, which becomes instrumental in flying the opium out of the jungles into places where they can be put on ships to be brought to the Corsican Mafia. And he's given a special security clearance in 1954 at the request of Allen Dulles. He's being given a special security clearance to engage in going into Guatemala to start organizing the military coup against the Guatemalan government of Arbenz. And he then he becomes a business partner. He becomes a business partner with John J. McCloy. And if you'll remember, John J. McCloy is the third of the trustees in the Anderson Trust. It's Robert Lovett, Robert Anderson, and John J. McCloy, all three of whom were Special Assistant Secretaries of War under Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War under Truman. And when in that meeting where Ed Lansdale and Charles Willoughby came back to the United States and met with Truman and told them about having uncovered this trove of $1.2 trillion in gold and platinum and silver and jewels, that those people were all in the meeting. That Robert Lovett and Robert Anderson and John J. McCloy, and William Pauly was a law partner with John J. McCloy. Okay? And in 1959, Pauly is given a special top secret security clearance to be able to participate in the anti-Castro program by Richard Nixon. And he's actually given a code name. He's given a code name to work under with the Central Intelligence Agency. And then Pauly, in September of 1960, after Castro has come to power, Pauly is going around Washington condemning Kennedy for having lost Cuba, as well as having lost China to the communists. So he's now overtly going around Washington, D.C., criticizing Kennedy and saying that he's soft on communism. And he begins traveling to what he refers to, interestingly enough, is other fraternal countries. That's his term that he uses for these. And this includes Brazil, and Argentina, and Paraguay, and Uruguay, in Spain, in Germany. He's going to all these places where the fascists have been put into power by utilizing the funds from the Anderson Trust. And so I want you to take a look at that thing. I don't know, there's about maybe 6 pages of a summary of all of the things that William Pauly was involved in that causes you to have some kind of an understanding of what the circles were that he moved in. He was very close with, as I said, very close with Henry Luce and Clare Boothe Luce, who were helping him run the Flying Tigers into China. He was very, very close with Allen Dulles, as the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was very close with John J. McCloy and Robert Lovett. He served as the direct assistant to Lovett. He ended up writing the Doolittle Report for Eisenhower. This guy is a guy who lives behind the scenes. And this is why he's so important, because he's not a name that you will normally ever hear about. And yet he is the guy who, as of the night of June 19th, was capable of declaring that we're going to kill Kennedy. And this is less than 6 months before Kennedy is killed. Okay? And then I am told then later by Santos Trafficante, actually my chief investigator, Bad Andy Tunney, was told directly by Trafficante that this is the very group that killed the president. Okay, so we have all of those things in place now, and what I want to do is I'm going to be directing our attention on Thursday when we come together again to the structure of the particular organizations and people that were basically surrounding Kennedy at this point in time, midway through 1963, at this point in time in June when Pauly states that he's going to be assassinated. And I'm going to bring in a large chart that we're building now at the office, a great big graphic chart of showing all of these groups and their relationship to each other. But I'll also get a copy of it printed out for you. It's just that when it's small enough for you to see it, and just a one page, it's a little hard. It's a little hard to read all of the things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the big chart for you, and we may end up putting it on one of those overlays that you can see, but we'll figure out how to do it. But the key is that, and I'm going to stop here at 5 o'clock so we can have a longer conversation about this, because this is the setup basically for being able to convince you and convince others to whom you talk in the future that these are the people that killed the president. Not because they shouldn't be interested in all of the previous history that we've gone through to understand how these people came into the positions of power that they were, that enabled them to set up all of these structures behind the scenes. But because I believe that if you are ultimately convinced that these are the people that green-lighted the assassination of President Kennedy, it causes the people to whom you're speaking to be more interested in caring about the fact that this has happened. And one of the things that I'm going to just spend a couple minutes just giving you some general idea of what we're going to be talking about on Thursday. So here's the key to this thing. The key to this is Brown Brothers Harriman. Okay, as I've made clear, I think, to you in the past, in that there's this whole series of private investors that are part of this. And remember, the CEO of this is George Herbert Walker. Okay? And that when he leaves and goes over to found the Union Bank of New York, okay, that he has his son-in-law, Prescott Bush, become the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman. And the people that you're dealing with in here is J.P. Morgan, who you'll remember, who's chief of staff. McGuire is the guy that attempted to organize the military coup against Roosevelt in 1934. You have John D. Rockefeller, here, and David Rockefeller, who are Standard Oil of New Jersey and California, okay, which is what William D. Pauly, who he was exploring for down in Brazil when he was the ambassador to Brazil. You have in here Irene DuPont, of the DuPont Chemical Corporation that was the makers of gunpowder and explosives in military armaments. That you have in here. You got E.H. Harriman. Okay, and Averill Harriman. The kind of people that you're talking about here, they referred to themselves in Brown Brothers Harriman referred to themselves as high income. What is it called? High income individuals. I think that high income individuals. That these are people with at that time over $50 million minimum each in order to qualify to be clients for Brown Brothers Harriman. They have to have $50 million of personal wealth in order to be their private investors. And then you need to understand that they're directly linked with, as I said before, is Sullivan and Cromwell. Okay, in that you have major business guys like here's United Fruit, United Fruit Corporation, which in fact leads down to Cromwell. Cromwell being involved he's the guy that helped overthrow the Panamanian government in order to establish the Panama Canal down here, and so that. This power elite that we're talking about here is critical for you to understand, because the senior partners in this include, as I said, Robert Lovett, and Robert B. Anderson, who are two of the senior partners, who are two of the trustees to the Anderson Trust. Okay, and which remember is $1.2 trillion that they have here, and this is the core of the group that we're talking about, because Robert Lovett is the guy that headed up the Lovett Commission, which is the first group to recommend the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency at the end of the Cold War, or at the end of World War II. So that these people here are and remember that up here the attorney for them is Allen Dulles. He's the attorney for Brown Brothers Harriman, and Allen Dulles is made the first civilian director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and they have this thing, the covert operations directorate. Okay, and the covert operations directorate is functioning directly under the principles of the Doolittle Commission, who is William D. Pauley. He's the one that was actually asked to put together the team that was there. And one of the other guys that was on this group was, in fact, the business partner of John J. McCloy. And John J. McCloy is the third of the trustees, who actually in the 1934 Olympics sat in the box in Germany with Adolf Hitler. And here, Alan Dulles, legal counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman, is the guy who sat in the meeting on January 3rd of 1933 in Germany and authorized Adolf Hitler becoming the Chancellor of Germany on the condition that he would agree to repay the loans that had been given to Germany at the end of World War I by the private investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman. Okay? So that what I'm suggesting is that the chart that you're going to see on Thursday is going to have other tentacles from it. But this is the core of the cabal that we're talking about here, in that you get stars here of Alan Dulles and William D. Pauley, and over here is George Herbert Walker, okay, and guys like Robert Lovett. These are crucial operations agents of this cabal. But these people just sit in their boardrooms. And these are the ones who own the shares of stock. These are the men who remain immune from any personal legal liability because they have created, and their fathers have created, the concept of the corporation, where the corporation exists and the owners of the shares of the corporation are immune from any liability for anything that they do. And the management are immune from anything the corporation does legally. And they're legally immune from anything the corporation does. And the board of directors members are immune. So in effect, these people serve as the board of directors. These are the board of directors, basically, for the cabal. And these other folks are operational people. George Herbert Walker, Alan Dulles, William Pauley, Lovett. These people are the field commanders. They're basically the majors, if you were in the military. These are the majors that are actually field commanders that are getting things done out in the field. And others remain the colonels above them. For example, Prescott Bush, in addition to being the CEO for Brown Brothers Harriman, was elected to be a United States Senator from Connecticut, and he served in the United States Congress as the major liaison to the Congress from the Central Intelligence Agency after it was created in 1947. That Prescott Bush would be made aware of particular covert operations that were going to be undertaken by Alan Dulles here in his capacity as the CIA director, that he would advise Prescott Bush, because Prescott Bush was in fact the CEO of the Brown Brothers Harriman, of which Alan Dulles was also the general counsel. And so he would tell Prescott Bush about what the covert operations were, and Prescott Bush would decide who in the United States Senate and who, if anybody, in the House of Representatives were to be briefed about covert operations that were going to be undertaken by the Central Intelligence Agency. And so what you see here, without it becoming too terribly complex, you see the core of the operation that is underway here. And that Dulles maintains his authority which got him appointed to be the first civilian director of the Central Intelligence Agency because of his position here. And so that even though Kennedy terminated him in the fall of 1961, following the debacle in the spring of the Cuban invasion at the Bay of Pigs, he still retained his full power as what the term that you should be using is the consigliere. He is the consigliere for this operation, for the cabal. And the consigliere is the Italian word that the Mafia has for a wartime legal counsel. That's who he is. He is the wartime legal counsel. And that's the key to Dulles. So Dulles, one of the things that you'll discover in your legal practice after you all go to law school is that the lawyers end up telling their clients, for the most part, what to do. Because the lawyers are the ones that are advising their clients as to what they can get away with. So even though these are the people that benefit financially, and these are the people who have the disposition to want a certain thing to happen, it's their consigliere and the consigliere's law firm that are in fact the ones calling the shots. Because they'll tell you what it is you can get away with, and they'll tell you which dispositions you have ought to be pursued. And that's the role that Dulles has here. And that's the role that Sullivan and Cromwell played. And that's why I would recommend to you probably getting a copy of the book, A Law Unto Itself. The book, A Law Unto Itself, is the story of Sullivan and Cromwell. And to understand that Sullivan and Cromwell is just not a normal law firm. This is a law firm that has been specifically and consciously set up to promote and foster the imperial ambitions of the investment clients to Brown Brothers Harriman. Okay? And that they also have access to the Central Intelligence Agency to engage in the kind of activities that they need to have engaged in order to foster and promote their imperial ambitions of basically securing privileged access to the strategic raw materials that these corporations that they own need to have in order to continue to foster and promote profits for themselves. So this is the key that you need to understand about this course. And as I said to you, the challenge you have is that even if you were to explain all of this to your parents or to your friends or to other people, they really don't care. They don't care because they're basically the beneficiaries of all of this. Because you have a country where you have 5% of the population of the planet basically gaining access to over 50% of all the non-renewable resources on the planet every single year. You know, and so that even though the benefits kind of filter down to people, you found yourselves by 1963, by 1963, where the middle class in the United States was actually living better than 99% of all of the royalty that lived back in the Middle Ages. You know, I mean, that these people were capable of garnering access to such a high percentage of the resources around the planet and had put together an industrial complex that was able to engine an economic system that could generate adequate resources to be able to hold for themselves, you know, basically, you know, half of all the value that they gained from doing this, but they could distribute the other 50% of the value out to the regular American people. And it would kind of filter down through the economic system, except for, of course, the black people and the Latinos and the other people who most of these people thought ought to be actually eliminated from the gene pool anyhow, which is exactly what the attitudes were that they had. You know, it's the white man's burden. It's manifest destiny. They were very clear about what their ideology was, and they were straightforward about it. All during that period from 1868 to 1898, the robber baron era, and that's why I recommend to you so much becoming familiar with that period of the robber barons, because they ended up being shameless about their assertions of what their ideology was, and they actually became strident about it in terms of manifest destiny. And they actually asserted that they were the leadership of some kind of exceptional nation that was blessed by their white anthropomorphic God to basically run the world. Okay? And that's why as long as the 50% of the additional income that was being generated by their activities was going just to white people, they were okay with that. Because it was basically taking care of their own, this kind of extended Caucasian family. And what we're encountering right now, and we'll get to it later in the course, is that something has gone wrong with this plan. You know, there's all these other people coming into the United States and claiming portions of the resources, or attempting to. And so that it isn't, and worse yet, there are these progressive upstarts that are even part of the Caucasian race that keep on trying to make them stop doing this, because they've got some kind of abstract attachment to some kind of set of ideals that runs contrary to this repugnant philosophy, as they term it in their own memos to each other. So this is the challenge that I want you to become familiar with, and as I say, in the context of the present election that you're looking at, and in the context of the major global climate change that is in the process of being foisted upon you by the heirs to these people. I mean, that's what's happening. You know, it's the petroleum industry, the coal industry, the major industrialists that are using coal and petroleum to engine their machinery to generate these global greenhouse gas emissions that they're spewing into the atmosphere. And even when they're on notice of the fact that they're destroying the ecosystem, they just keep right on going, because they have created this monster of the corporation that actually is completely immune from any kind of moral considerations. And that's the challenge that we're confronted by, because the only way to really protect ourselves ultimately against the ravages of the global climate change is to deal with the structure of the corporation. That it has to be undone. And the challenge that we have is that these people have figured out how to get their lawyers appointed to the Supreme Court, into the federal courts. And what they will do under pressure every time is they'll start to assert that the corporations are people, and that they're entitled to the protection of due process, and their property rights have to be safeguarded against regulation by the state. And so what they try to do is they try to invoke all of the same natural law principles that adequately engine a good faith belief in the protection of fundamental rights of individual human beings, and they try to commandeer them for the corporation, so they can end up killing the people who have human rights. Okay? So that's the reason for this course. is to try to prepare you to deal with this global climate change that is going to be confronting your generation and your children. You know? So that you're going to have to understand that you aren't going to be able to just, tell everybody they ought to, get better light bulbs in their house, or even put solar panels on their own individual roof. That's not going to stop these guys. That the fact that Pope Francis has said in his papal encyclical, and I want to hasten to point out, I point to that only because it's gotten more press than almost anybody else talking about global climate change. And that apparently one of the students in last spring's class wrote a letter to the head of the philosophy department and said that he thought that my lectures were too religious. I just found out about that a couple of days ago. I didn't really notice that aspect to the lectures. Just because I'm suggesting that there is a source of ethical reasoning which is grounded in a natural law principle, which is exactly what our whole Constitution was founded on, it doesn't strike me as being inherently or inappropriately religious. I'm not trying to convert any of you to Catholicism or Buddhism or anything else, even though I have suggested to you that meditating is probably pretty helpful for you to get a little perspective on all of these things. But this is what I want to just put in front of us here today as the kind of core or central pivot off from which all of the rest of the things start to take place, which are going to be on the larger schematic, which I'm going to be giving to you on Thursday. Because I want to set the stage for you to really understand who William D. Pauly is and who William D. Pauly is talking about when he says we are going to kill the president. Okay, so that's the context of this, and that it's going to. We still have the 15 minutes that we would like to have to discuss these things, and as I said, I'm trying to get better about not just dosing you with this, and then when it comes time for the questions, you guys are standing there like deer in front of the headlights. I want to soften the transition here because there have to be questions that you have about this, which I can help share information about. That if I would say if I have it, but I'm sure I have it. That's why I'm here, because others, not necessarily everybody in the administration, but at least important ones, believe that I happen to have access to information which I can give you in a manner that you can verify it, extrinsic to just my having told you so. There are a few things that are kind of very individual from the experience, like when I told you about Joseph Burkholder Smith telling me about his experience in coming on in being the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City when Tom Polgar was brought on by Theodore Shackley to be the new chief of station. That's something that nobody else knows about. And that there are other things like the fact that this was said by William Pauly, that I know that because of talking directly with Dick Billings, who stood right there when it was being said. Okay, and say Dick Billings went on to try to figure out what to do about that, because as soon as he heard that the president had been killed, he immediately fastened on that event that had taken place back in June, on the night of June 19th, less than 6 months earlier, saying, holy mackerel, this guy said they were going to kill the president, and now he's been killed. And he went to such great lengths that he ended up being on the team, leading the team that secured the Zapruder film to try to prove that in fact it wasn't a single gunman that killed the president. He worked diligently inside Life magazine that was owned by Henry Luce, who's a close personal friend of William Pauley and Allen Dulles, both. In fact, Allen Dulles was having an affair with Henry Luce's wife, Claire Booth Luce. And Luce knew it and didn't mind. I mean, that's how I guess the word is incestuous, probably, this whole group is. That they know each other, they marry each other's daughters and sons, they go to the same clubs, they have the same devoted interest in this fascist ideology of wedding the interests of the corporations to the state and having the state engage in activity, primarily military and diplomatic, to secure access to the resources for these corporations. And anybody who tries to get in the way of this, as was said in the Doolittle report, that no one can be allowed to stand in the way of the effectuation of this mission. That was exactly what Pauley wrote in the Doolittle report. And what we're getting ready to look at is an example of someone who not only tried to stand in the way of them doing this, but was attempting to disassemble the fundamental structures pursuant to which these people had seized and asserted control over the world at that time. Okay, so that's we have 15 minutes left, and I would like to stimulate questions from you. I know that I know what it is that you're on such intense intake in talking about these things that it's hard to kind of shift over into kind of reflecting on what the implications are and what kind of questions you've got, etc. But I want to try to help you do that to facilitate it in some way. Okay? But it's just the students that I need to do Rex right now. Yeah? Okay? So I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable with anything, but who's got the first question? Good.
Okay. When does Dulles stop acting in his capacity as the chief legal counsel for Sullivan and Conrad?
When he died. And I think he died in 1963 or no, not 63. He died like 4 or 5 years later. I'll get that for you. But he stayed functioning.
69.
What is it?
69.
69. Yeah. You know, so he stayed right on board. In 69, you know, there's most of the senior partners in the big Wall Street law firms are anywhere from 65 to 70. So he was still very much in the flush of his power at that point, and was appointed by Lyndon Johnson to be on the Warren Commission, along with John J. McCloy. Yeah. The big question. Yes. It's interesting that's a major piece that I've got to do in the book is once getting all of this stuff established is try to determine exactly where the present generation is. Now we know Halliburton. We know about Halliburton and Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and being in the World Bank, and there's a way of going at it and the other way of identifying people, in a sense, by their conduct and their location inside certain areas as to what they're doing and the kind of power and influence they've got. I'm still trying to figure out exactly where the nest is, because it doesn't appear, like, for example, Goldman Sachs. I mean, you hear over and over and over and over and over and over again about Goldman Sachs and their people all being appointed to be, the head of the World Bank, the head of the Fed, the Secretary of Treasury. They're in charge of the economic advisors to the presidents and one administration after another, et cetera. And I'm going to be examining that whole thing to try to determine exactly what the present manifestation of them is. That's the kind of thing that drives the publishers completely crazy when you're going to put that in, because you're basically accusing them of being the inheritors of the assassination of the president. But I'll figure this out for us, and I'm going to put it in the book. I've got about 600 pages of the book done now, but my experience is you have to get up to around 1,500 pages of the draft in order to kind of squeeze it down. But that's a great question, a good one. Let me just check on the students here.
In terms of like a present iteration of this group, kind of like you were talking
Yes.
about, do you think that the CIA is still as important as it is in this period, or have like the institutional focuses changed?
Well, the CIA is now overtly doing the killing. I mean, the covert operation, they felt that they had to have kind of an off-channel S-force set up to actually kill Castro and the people. And now they don't feel that anymore. They're running the drone program. They're the ones that are making the targeting decisions, and they're the ones that are giving the authorization to kill. They've got young Air Force men and women sitting there with the joystick, popping the people, and everybody within a city block of them. But it's the Central Intelligence Agency that's making that decision. And John Brennan, is there. Because what they've done is they have succeeded in transitioning over to anti-terrorism from the anti-communism. And so they're still being able to conceal the fact that what they're dealing with is a reaction to the fascist imperialist activities that they engage in, like invading and occupying the Middle Eastern oil fields, right at the very beginning of the end of the Cold War, that we started the course out with. They're talking about what in fact George H.W. Bush did in writing the memo to Saddam Hussein and luring him into basically going down into Kuwait so they could invoke the old 1972 treaty and go to the King Faoud and get him to invite them in. That's how they did it. So that right now that they're not dealing with this in as systematic a way as they used to, because it's true that the communists and socialists at least had a bead on what they were dealing with. They were dealing with Caucasian nation-state-based capitalism, which is fascism. And they recognized it, and they were belling the cat and naming the beast and getting people mobilized to do something about it. The terrorists don't know that. I mean, they just think that they're not Islamic. And so that's not exactly the problem. That the problem with these people isn't that they're not Islamic. The problem is that they're fascists and imperialists. And so that there's no real force in the field dealing with it. And the fact is that once all this total bullshit about them wanting to establish an Islamic caliphate, and establish Sharia law in every country. I mean, that nobody believes that, But the fact is that as soon as they get the American and Allied forces driven out of the Middle Eastern oil fields, they'll stop. They're not going to come chasing us around because they don't like our lifestyle, But so the CIA is involved in trying to basically whack them down like a whack-a-whack-a, whatever that thing is, that where they whack the moles, whack a mole. They're just trying to whack them down like that, and they keep popping right back up because we're still occupying the oil fields, And until we get out of the oil fields, they're going to continue doing that. But as soon as they get us out of the oil fields, the U.S. is going to have to then turn its attention to China and start identifying China as the basic antipode for them, because the fascists and the capitalists are second paradigm dialecticians that they have to identify, because they don't want to brand themselves as straight out authoritarians. The first paradigm authoritarians that just have to superimpose their will on the world because it's just total chaos without their authority. So they pose as dialecticians. So they've got to have an effective adversary that they can blame for them having to do all these terrible things. You know, so the Central Intelligence Agency is still the house of all of that. You know, and the moves to get the Central Intelligence Agency dissolved at the end of the Cold War were almost non-existent. You know, you had who was it? It was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the United States Senator from New York, who intelligently enough, upon the dissolution of the Soviet Union, introduced a bill into the Senate to dissolve the Central Intelligence Agency, since it was ostensibly created to deal with this ominous group that was attempting to, you know, conquer the world. And like nobody would even allow it to get to first base. They wouldn't even give it a hearing, you know, in any of the committees in the House or Senate. So, you know, they know what they're doing. That it doesn't exist to stop communism. It exists to promote and foster the fascist ideology and the imperialist ideology that they are characterized by. And that's the job of the CIA. So they're still there.
It was something you said before. I was just like, the idea that not a lot of people believe that like Islam is trying to take over the world. I think that's actually the primary ideological function of kind of imperialism in America, where I know Republican relatives who literally believe that any Muslim pretending to be a democratic, like, liberal person is secretly committing jihad as part of some massive project coordinated by all Muslim countries. Like, I think that that's a really serious threat to the discourse in America around things like this, because ultimately a lot of people will justify it in that, like, well, we have to be this ruthless to fight the ruthless enemy.
Oh, well, it's partly, in my opinion, it's partly the consequence of the state running the educational systems in the high schools. And now, even as good faith as Bernie is, say all the state universities, you know, ought to be providing free education for American students, right? And the problem is that the state, as Rudolf Steiner pointed out, is in fact going to teach the students exactly what the people who run the state want them to believe. And what they do is they train young Americans to believe that whatever the people in positions of authority tell them is what they're supposed to do. And at the same time, they have this strange undercurrent of talking about revolutionaries and the Revolutionary War, and they all rose up against these awful royalists and all that kind of stuff. So they're sort of sowing the seeds of their own potential destruction by letting that undercurrent go on. But the overcurrent is, you know, don't get out of line or the principal's going to have you on the carpet, you know, and you'll be out of here, you know, and don't challenge the teacher in a classroom or you're disrupting a class and you're out of here, you know. And so do what the coach tells you to do, you know, or you won't make the team, you know. Do what the women's athletic director, the basketball coach wants you to do, or else you're not going to be popular. You know, that there's a process of the state running the schools that have an agenda to teach the students to be obedient to authority. And they're not as transparent and raw about it as they were in Germany in the 1930s, but they're just as effective. And so that when they start hearing people in positions of authority laying out a narrative to them, you know, that gives at least the facial appearance of explaining what it is that's going on around them that they see going on, they just swallow it up and then regurgitate it. You know, really, they just regurgitate it. You know, and they couldn't pass a test on it. You know, so you have to be careful about how you respond to that. You know, what you should do is say, look, and it's very hard because they're so intemperate about their insecure belief in this stuff that if you ask them a question or two that reveals the fact that they don't have the slightest idea what they're talking about, all they do is get furious. You know, so the art of trying to figure out how to explain this to people is very important. Now, we have the advantage that we get to spend, 20 90-minute periods together, finding out about all this stuff. And I'm trying to put it in kind of a systematic, step-by-step kind of presentation that'll facilitate it kind of unfolding to you so that you kind of have a full view of it when we get done here and how it came to pass, and so that you'll understand how it came to pass, and so that it's not so stunning to you that these people could have actually green-lighted and authorized the assassination of the president and gotten away with it. And even though virtually all the people who could pass a test on the assassination itself, that none of them believe that Oswald killed the president. None of them. And yet they still promote it in all the news channels. Every time the anniversary comes around, they start talking about Lee Harvey Oswald and make another movie with somebody else starring him and showing that he was weirder and stranger than even the last year. But that's all they keep doing. That's the purpose of going to college, ideally, is learning something different about that. And that's what we're trying to do here. Okay? Yes?
With regards to what you said about the need to kind of disassemble the corporations
Yes.
to have an impact on the environmental crisis, how would that logistically happen? 'Cause it would seem that it'd have to come from Congress, but it doesn't seem likely.
Well, that's the challenge. The challenge is that they have gotten into buying the Congress openly. So one of the very first things that has to be done is the replacements on the Supreme Court, Scalia's replacement, and then Bader Ginsburg's replacement, and then probably Breyer's replacement, and hopefully Kennedy's replacement over the next 8-year period, have to be people that are dedicated to reversing the Citizens United. And the previous precedents that were established back during the robber baron era that asserted that corporations were people. So what there has to be is another resurgence similar to what happened under Franklin Roosevelt. That Roosevelt mounted this whole attack on the court to threaten to pack the court, to raise the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 9 to 12, and appoint 3 liberals who would agree that corporations were not people and they were not entitled to the protection of due process and all that to the same degree. So that's the first step. And once you can get that one set aside, then what you have to do is start going after all of these people who have now basically exposed themselves as to how raw the buying of the Congress really is. And so what you need to say is, look, now that they're not allowed to do that as a corporation, you have to be on guard about how they're going to try to do it in a different way. And you have to get the laws passed. Now, the problem is that Hillary Clinton isn't likely to do that because she has worked out, not irrationally, has worked out a détente with those forces so that they allow moderate change, but they don't allow any kind of radical or progressive change. And so that what I believe we have to do, as we talked about in the last discussion, I think that what has to happen is people need to start right now mobilizing an insurrection inside the Democratic Party to get a true progressive to run in the Democratic primaries in 2020 against Hillary Clinton based on the kind of things that she can be totally predicted to do between now and 2020 of doing things that are supportive of the corporations. And that there's one of the key aspects of such a campaign has to be the removal of immunity from the stockholders and board of directors and management of the corporations. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a group of people getting together and trying to engage in business. And there's nothing wrong with entrepreneurial spirit or private property or anything like that. But when you allow them to establish this type of a creature, of this kind of an investment vehicle and a business vehicle that is completely devoid of any social conscience, and it's having the kind of repercussions it's having on the culture. And the only advantage we have now is that it's doing it to everybody. They used to just do it to the poor and the black and the Hispanic and to the women. In the textile mills, they used to just get away with it because they were powerless. And so what we have to do now is we have to mobilize the power of the moment of it being done to all of us to disassemble this type of protection that those corporations have. So I think that's how we have to do it.
Just to follow up, I agree with what you're saying, but it's kind of frustrating because like the insurrection that you're talking about, it's like, isn't that like what Bernie Sanders is trying to do, and it's not working?
Oh no, but it is, but it took everybody by such surprise.
Sure.
Whoa, wait a second. And the great advantage is you need to remember that of the people 35 and below, 83% of you voted for Bernie. And that's going to be even more in 2020. So and there's a larger and larger percentage. The millennialists are rising into a position of political power now, and that there are allies that you have among the baby boomers that will participate in this with you. And so the key is we have to identify someone possibly like Russ Feingold, I've mentioned before, who's the new senator that's going to be elected now in the fall in Wisconsin, and to push them forward as a spokesperson in the Congress, in the Senate, for these ideas, and push, and when she resists them, to run them as candidate. That's how, and we've got to be clear about what the particular pieces are, and that the corporation is the target. Okay? I think, yes, no, is that it? Okay. He's just calling me off. I thought it was something else. Okay. All right. So I'll see you on Thursday, and we'll be working on building our little chart for you so you can see what's going on. On Thursday, I'm going to print out for you and have a big visual chart of the structure of all of these different organizations that they had set up. The World Commerce Corporation and the International Commerce Corporation and the Field Intelligence, Field Operations Intelligence, and the other things that I've been talking to you about. But it's hard to really get a sense of how kind of all-encompassing these types of institutions were unless you get a look at them in the structure that they set up. And then I went through the whole process leading up to the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then the events that started taking place after the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis that basically started causing the one group after another to develop such an intense hostility to Kennedy that they were actually starting to contemplate killing him in order to stop him from doing the kind of things he was doing. That we know that after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy stated that he was going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds because of their not only deceiving him about the Bay of Pigs prospects, but explicitly trying to trap him into having to go ahead and commit U.S. Marine Corps troops into invading Cuba rather than losing. And he was really angry at them for that. And then they came to him later in March of 1962 proposing Operation Northwoods to him to dress up the Cuban refugees, the exiles in Cuban military uniforms, and have them attack Guantanamo naval base and kill American sailors and sink American ships and blow up shopping malls in Miami and in Washington, D.C. And we started seeing what it is that Kennedy started to do. He when he was confronted on that night of October 20, nuclear test ban treaty. and Averill Harriman refused to do it. He went there, but he never made the proposal to them. But the fact is that Kennedy then, through his private correspondence with Khrushchev in these 18 letters, on August 5th of 1963, he entered into an agreement with Khrushchev that they were going to take steps to disassemble the nuclear warheads. And Kennedy got the United States Senate to ratify a partial test ban treaty on September 24th of 1963. He actually got them to agree to ban all nuclear testing in the atmosphere, all nuclear testing under the oceans, and all nuclear testing in outer space. So that he and Khrushchev were able to get that part actually agreed to by the United States Senate. But he had given this secret order to Averill Harriman to actually get an agreement as part of the treaty to disassemble all of the nuclear weapons of both the Soviet Union and the United States. And obviously Averill Harriman told others in the elite community. As you know, that Harriman of Brown Brothers Harriman, they would share with the other private investors in Brown Brothers Harriman these types of strategic decisions that were being made by Kennedy. And so that we know that by September of 1963, Averill Harriman had refused to submit that request to the Soviet Union, but Kennedy had succeeded through his private correspondence with Khrushchev to secure this agreement to disassemble the nuclear warheads. Then later in June, on June 5th, actually a little bit earlier, this extraordinarily interesting and important event took place. Walter Sheridan, who was a very important close confidant of Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General under John Kennedy, that 7th and 28th of 1962, with the full decision on the part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the unanimous decision to attack the island of Cuba, with full realization that this would result in a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, because this had followed their effort back in earlier in 1963, in July of 1963, where they tried to get Kennedy to agree to a first strike nuclear sneak attack against the Soviet Union, that they had become convinced that we had such a dominant lead in the nuclear missiles that we could flatten the Soviet Union and kill virtually all of their population in a sneak attack before they could effectively retaliate against us. And Kennedy had been grossly offended at what it is that they were recommending. And so that there was this growing division between not Kennedy and not only his Central Intelligence Agency, but his Joint Chiefs of Staff and others, because Kennedy had clearly, as I discussed with you, had this kind of metanoia experience on that night of October 27th to 28th, when he was confronted with the insistence on the part of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff that they be allowed to attack Cuba and trigger a nuclear exchange. And ever since that type of experience, we remember that when we reviewed the steps that Kennedy started taking to order the stand down from DEFCON 2 that Curtis LeMay had ordered everybody to go to without the president's consent, the order from Kennedy to withdraw the Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for Khrushchev agreeing to withdraw the missiles from Cuba, his reaching out to open up a back channel of communications to Fidel Castro to normalize relations with Cuba, and then engaging in this exchange of these 18 super secret letters using Norman Cousins the journalist that ran the Post, to communicate these letters back and forth, pursuant to which Kennedy was planning to try to disassemble the nuclear warheads of the Soviet Union and the United States. We went through these series of activities that were going on from that night of October 27, 28 of 1962, all the way during the year of 1963, when Kennedy, step by step, was taking these steps to do these various things. And I want to pick it up here at this point to really start to give you a clear understanding of the kind of drumbeat that was going on with Kennedy planning to do these things for, as we knew, that one of the main things that triggered these resentments was that after the resolution of the Bay of Pigs, I told you that Frank Sturgis, who was in charge of the exile paramilitary camp on No Name Key, on December 3rd of 1962, launched a military attack against the Russian ship in the harbor, in Havana Harbor, and sank it. And Kennedy, Bobby, and John sent in the helicopter gunships and burnt out that base, and then did the same thing with regard to the base in the Everglades that was under the coordination of E. Howard Hunt. And this caused the people that were directly involved, these extreme right-wing Cuban anti-communist paramilitary groups, to want to kill Kennedy. They were so furious with him for betraying them, and that Kennedy had also begun this process that he was going through. Actually led him to issue a secret national security action memorandum. He issued this is National Security Action Memorandum 239 that he issued to the State Department, ordering the ambassador to Russia, who was Averill Harriman, who is the son of E.H. Harriman, of Brown Brothers Harriman. He ordered Averill Harriman, to go to Russia and to propose to the Soviets So now we've gone over that series of things that the elite people in the cabal that are the private investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman and clients for the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. Here, I'll move this over here a little bit more. I'm a little off center with everybody. Okay, and what the steps are that they took at the end of the Cold War to begin setting up different institutions that they could, from which they could function and carry out their same agenda of basically promoting and fostering a fascist ideology in the world. A major one of which is the major base they established in South America, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Peru, and Chile, and Uruguay, and Paraguay, etc., and shipping in hundreds and hundreds of high-level Nazi officials and SS officers, etc., and they were functioning from there and had the base set up inside the security department of Pemex, the Mexican National Oil Company, and of course then creating the Central Intelligence Agency and having a whole covert operations directorate inside the CIA, out of which they were engaged in promoting fascist ideology around the world, using funds in part that they had gotten from the Anderson Trust. This trust, the secret trust that had been set up with a $1.2 trillion of gold and platinum and silver and jewels that had been uncovered in the Philippines by Edward Lansdale in conjunction with General MacArthur and his chief of intelligence, Charles Willoughby, that came and told Truman about the existence of that, and Truman ended up setting up the secret trust, the Anderson Trust, and placing two of the senior partners of Brown Brothers Harriman being in charge of utilizing these $1.2 trillion in gold certificates that were issued. We covered all of the setting up of that type of a structure, and what I'm going to do next week, or excuse me, on Thursday,